Hello, U.S. History class. We are back with Unit 6, Section 6, and our discussion on the Great Depression. Now, the funny thing about the Great Depression, as if there can be a funny thing about something called the Great Depression, we've already kind of talked about some of this intro. So as we were transitioning, we talked about the 20s, which, I said was, 29, including like 29 up to 32, which is kind of the start of this Great Depression conversation and period. So the end of, this 20s era, kind of is going to come along with this, because where the shift is in our discussion of the Great Depression is going to come with a change in administration, a change in leadership in the White House away from, Herbert Hoover and to, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who we're going to introduce to you today. So let's take a real quick minute and let's review with Unit 6, Section 6, the causes of the Great Depression. And this was in our last set of notes. We put these in, but we're gonna kind of hit them again. All right. So the causes of the Great Depression. A lot of this is going to be promoted by something that was called over speculation, and that's a simple answer for what caused a broad economic collapse. But it had to do with farming, agriculture, lack of European demand, overbuild, et cetera, et cetera. But over speculation, where people are borrowing for investments in the stock market, they borrow all this money, and then the stock market will crash. All right. And so we have this stock market crash, and it is crashing off of borrowed money. All right. And so what happens is this lack of income, this lack of money leads to no new investments in the national economy. There's not anybody jumping into business to kind of shore up and fix the shortcomings that already existed. So because of that, there's no consumer or commercial purchasing, because, we're not ramping back up into the market, healing the national economy, which means that because nobody is investing in, this type of purchasing power, there's going to be less overall national production. And for those of you who have been through economics and personal finance, the idea of the GDP, the gross domestic product, et cetera. And so because of the fact that there is less production, less manufacturing, less service, less this, less that, well, guess what? That means less jobs, okay? Less jobs. And when there are less jobs and nobody's making anything and nobody has any money, we are at the Great Depression. If you look over into your side column, you're going to see a set of dates. And the Great Depression will last from 1929 until 1942. All right? Now, despite all the things that we're going to be learning about that the federal government is going to do to pull us out of this Great Depression period, it's really the economic ramp up of World War II that is going to put an end to this terrible cycle, which lasts all the way through the 1930s. And that cycle really goes, there's no production. All right. Nobody's, in other words, nobody's building anything. They're not selling anything. And so because there's no production, there's no money. And because there's no money to pay people, there's no jobs. And because there's no jobs where people are working, there's no production. And because of that, there's no money. And guess what? It's a cycle. And it's a cycle that lasts for one of the hardest decades in the history of the United States. So when we look at the realities of the Great Depression, how did the Great Depression affect everyday Americans? You hear some of the rhetoric of this now when people are facing economic hardship. I mean, America is down 10 million jobs from where it was a year ago. And so because of that, you hear people say things like this: why didn't you save some money for the future? Why didn't you plan? Guess what? I did. All right. I did save, or I did the best I could with the money I made, but in the end, it's not going to be enough. And people are going to be forced to make desperate decisions. People who lost their job are going to move around the country and try to find other jobs. Or in an extreme example from New Jersey, here is a lady who is, trying to sell her children because she can't afford to raise or feed them. That is desperation, desperate times, desperate measures. Well, how desperate was it, right? The Great Recession that happened, in the end of the Bush presidency, 2006, 7, and 8. I think the unemployment numbers got to like 11 or 12%, maybe even a little higher than that, 13%. I mean, just terrible. Well, the joblessness rate by 1932, which is the end of Herbert Hoover's presidency, are you ready for this? 27%. That means for every 100 people that wanted a job, all right, almost 30 of them could not find a job. There are higher rates in cities. Remember, in cities, where you have, these big manufacturing firms or factories that are making, everybody works for Ford, everybody works for Westinghouse. Well, now nobody's buying those things. And so the joblessness rate, for instance, in Chicago in 1932, had gone to 50%. All right. Well, half of the people there, couldn't find a job. And so you see these, dramatic signposts of the era that people are living in. So you've got this sign, about the world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And then people lined up to try to get unemployment assistance from a charity. Signs outside of towns, jobless men, keep going. We can't take care of our own, and it's always that thing about, people don't want to hand out, they want to hand up. So what does that look like? What were people struggling with? Well, I mean, it was flat out desperation. And we learned so much about the Great Depression through pictures. And you might look at some of these extraordinary pictures and you're like, wow, how do we get so many of these, looks into people's private lives and private homes? And a lot of it will come about from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He is going to put people to work when he comes in and takes over as president, doing things like writing or taking pictures or beautifying, whatever, just anything to get people working. I always remember this picture. This is a man named Bud Gaw. He lived in Alabama. And when this picture was taken, two realities came out of this picture. One reality is the photographer said, hey, you want to put some pants on your son? And he said, I ain't got no pants. Now, look, I've been broke, but I have always had pants. So when we talk about desperation, this is the type of desperation that we are talking about. Home foreclosures. By 1932, all right, half of the home loans in the United States, were delinquent, all right? And what does delinquent mean? It means they were behind. All right, they were late, half of them. And 1 million families in the United States had lost their farms. Now, look, this was before, we still had a huge percentage of people in the South, that kind of stuff, and in the Midwest that did private farming. This is how they were making their living. But remember, starting in about 23, when European countries, 24, stopped buying a lot from American farmers, the Depression started earlier for farms because of the decline of demand of agriculture overseas. And so you end up facing, just an incredible amount of desperation. People are dealing with a lack of basics, the things that they need to survive. They do not have food, they do not have clothes, and they do not have shelter. All right. And so how will the government look at these long lines of unemployed people, these hungry children, people without pants, people without shoes, people without dinner, and deal with it? Well, there was an idea that was being kicked around in, the Republican political party in conservative circles, and it was called voluntarism. All right. So what is voluntarism? Voluntarism basically says that, that communities should rise up and take care of those people that are struggling themselves. And a lot of communities really try to do this. This is, people setting up free coffee and free donuts for the unemployed. It's a business saying, hey, here's free coffee, here's free donuts. You know, Al Capone and some of the gangsters did this. You know, lots of churches would have, you know, like we get real used to Brunswick stews, the idea of a community stew. Well, those types of things were being done by, you know, churches and companies and private industries to support the people that, you know, lived around their communities who were struggling. But, you know, the truth is this. I mean, this is an unmitigated, unparalleled disaster in America. Okay. And so charities tried to feed the starving. I mean, like they worked really hard for it. You know, and you had, you know, rich people that were donating to causes, and they used to set up things called bread and soup lines where, you know, like you could get, you know, you bring your own cup and they give you a big chunk of soup or, you know, a big spoon of stew. But I mean, here you see people that are in this line. It's 5-6 wide. They set up to offer people free bread. Look at this line. I want you to see, I mean, you're going to have to pay attention. This line goes all the way down this block and then around the corner and down the other side of the other street. That's how many people are lining up for a free chunk of bread. This is not something that basic charity services is going to repair. You know, there is one entity that is large enough and powerful enough to affect the suffering of, you know, millions and millions of Americans on a national scale, and that is the you know, the federal arm of the American government. All right, and people are going, you know, in desperation, you know, to their government officials and saying, "Please, you got to do something to help us." And you know, the government under Hoover is really not doing anything. And you know, increasingly, people are going to start fleeing around the country to places that they think they might have other opportunities or opportunities to work. So many people lost their homes that these almost little homeless villages start popping up in urban areas all over the United States, you know, in every city. And they call these little slum villages Hoovervilles. All right. And it is a shade directly towards the president of the United States. All right, these Hoovervilles. And the reason for, you know, nicknaming of this, these little slum towns of, you know, tacked together houses made out of discarded planks and boxes, is because they said, hey, like he's putting us in these things by not helping. All right, not assisting the people in America that are suffering. Okay. Including this particular Hooverville, which was set up in the middle of Washington, D.C. And it was World War I veterans who had gone to D.C. to ask for, you know, bonuses and that kind of stuff to help. And so, I mean, when you look and it's like it's women, it's children, it's veterans, et cetera, et cetera. So it is broad suffering that's happening all over. Now, we learned about labor. Labor is not gone during this time, and labor unions during this time are growing increasingly hostile. And what do I mean by that? Well, you know, jobs are so scarce and so difficult, you know, that there is a militant expansion of unions where they say, like, basically, you know, we're not going to have our hours cut. We're not going to have our pay cut. We're not going to break up our income between different people, where they are fighting, you know, to keep the jobs they have, saying that it is their right to work and create a living for their family. Now, this militancy that had, this should say militancy, by the way. This militancy towards business and industry, you know, is going to slow down the attempts by private business at an economic recovery. So what I mean by that is, like, they say, you know, Billy works 50 hours and 50 hours is enough for Billy to pay his rent, buy food, you know, blah, 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 blah. And so what industry is doing is they're trying to hire Billy and Stan for 25 hours apiece. But Billy says, no, we're not going to do that because I'm going to lose my house just like Stan did. And Stan just wants an opportunity to work and make any money because he's starving. And so what I mean by this militancy in labor, I mean, there's two sides to every coin, but I mean that, these are people that are frequently participating in strikes and riots and protests and all the things that we learned about that labor unions can do collectively to kind of try to control what business is doing. In this time, there's no easy answers, I mean, this is not something that America had experienced. And so Congress starts stepping in, being the direct representatives of the American people. And they start investigating the actions of the federal government and saying, like, oh, why aren't we being more effective? Why aren't we doing other things? And what their investigations reveal are broad corruptions. There's all types of corruptive, unseemly, activities that are taking place in government that are unfair, that perhaps is shaping what government is doing to protect, maybe business and industry over the American worker. And that the Wall Street stock market, which collapsed, perhaps there, were things that had, increased the suffering of people in exchange for protecting business. All right. And when we look at Wall Street, I mean, look at this. It had fallen to a low of 41 points in 1932. And that's incredibly low when you consider today it's at 20,000. But 40 points in 1932, that means that it was down 89.2% from its all-time high. I mean, you're talking about almost going down 90% from where it had been between 1929 and 1932. This is as low as America can get, except for other bad things are going to be happening at the same time. All right. What else could possibly happen that is bad during the Great Depression? Have you all ever heard of something called the Dust Bowl? The Dust Bowl started in 1930. All right. What is the Dust Bowl? Well, we got to kind of tie a few different things we've learned about together to bring this in. So there's all these economic problems that are going, right? And so that means that because farmers are making less and less money, they're trying to grow more and more crops so they can get a greater profit. And so the agricultural areas that are located in the Midwestern part of the United States, that part that when we talk about like the closing of the West, that part where, all these big agribusinesses had rushed in and started, trying to create these giant ranches and these giant farming businesses to ship things back and forth to the coasts. They're going to suffer a man-made economic disaster, not economic, a man-made environmental disaster. All right. And what happens is basically, when all of this farming technology had come into the Midwest, all of these tractors and all of these plows and all this kind of stuff, they over-farmed this territory. They farmed it and plowed it and ripped it apart. Okay. And so it's going to turn out that we just happen to, in this time period, experience a drought. And the drought is going to really dry the soil up. And all of the overproduction and years of intense plowing, where they had plowed and plowed and plowed and turned the soil, along with the drought that takes all the moisture out of the soil, and a windstorm that comes across the Midwest. It's one of those derecho, El Nino, things that happens periodically and seasonally. They allow strong winds to come in and literally blow the topsoil away. All right. And so all of the lush, nutrient-rich soil that people relied on to be able to farm is gone, leaving dust, desert. A lot of people call this getting tractored out. And what it is this. No guy with a plow on a horse would ever be able to degrade the environment like the environment was degraded by mechanized agriculture. But mechanized agriculture allowed the entire Midwest
to dry up and die and blow away in the breeze. Okay? When we talk about a desperation, all right? I mean, this is what we mean. People are being hit personally, and people are being hit economically. Conditions were so bad that without looking at the pictures, without thinking of the human story of mothers that can't wash their children or fathers that can't feed their children. Nobody has shoes or clothes or medicine. It's hard for us to understand. And this doesn't happen for a month or 2 months or 6 months. This happens for a decade. People grew up in this. I mean, this was their childhood. Conditions that were so awful that millions of these farmers and other people, right, other Americans, just had to abandon where they lived. They just had to leave their houses. Like nobody's buying them. They're just abandoning them. They're loading up in their car. They're choosing homelessness for the opportunity to eat. And there's a term for these people, all right? And you do need to know the term. It's over in the left-hand column. When we talk about people that were fleeing the Dust Bowl, a lot of that was happening in the city of Oklahoma. And these people will be called the Okies. O-K-I-E-S. The Okies. And they're not all from Oklahoma, but it is the discriminatory term that is applied to the millions of Americans that take to the road and start just traveling from one end of the country to the other, seeking agricultural work, that are filling up the streets and back alleys, with homelessness, from people that are fleeing these disasters, this endless crush of economic suffering. Americans had lost hope. All right. And whenever people lose hope, I mean, like, it's hard to get it back. And they had lost hope in the grips of extreme poverty. And despite all of this, Hoovervilles and hunger and poverty, the government inactivity continued throughout Hoover's presidency. He watched this happen. He watched this play out in the newspapers, in the pictures, in people's lives, and he went fishing, So what's going to change all of this? What's going to be the turning point? It's going to be an election, all right? And the election of this man, by the way, is why when you pick up a 10-cent piece, you see this guy's face on it, all right? And his name is Roosevelt. So if you look at your notes, it says the 3 R's, Roosevelt to the rescue. His name is Franklin that's an I, Delano Roosevelt. Why do I tell you his middle name? And this time in our history, people would generally go by, their first and last middle name. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John, Fitzgerald Kennedy, etc. A lot of times people would call Franklin Delano Roosevelt by his initials, FDR. I will frequently refer to him as FDR. It is common. He would be elected in 1932. He would immediately do the opposite of what Hoover had done. He would begin to combat the Great Depression. He is the only man in the history of the United States to be elected 4 times. All right. Serving as president from 1932 until his death in 1945. Okay. So 4 times he is elected. He doesn't serve all 4 terms because he dies in his 4th. And when he comes out and he wins the election in 32, and we're going to talk a little more about him. We're just introducing him today. He says, and the country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. And that's what FDR is going to do. He is going to try something over and over and over again. FDR promises Americans
what he calls a New Deal. Remember Roosevelt, the earlier Roosevelt,
Teddy Roosevelt promised Americans a square deal, fairness. Roosevelt here promises Americans a new deal, all right, that says that the Great Depression will be combated with programs that focus on the 3 R's. So, what are the 3 R's?
They are relief, recovery, and reform. I will make it where the suffering is not so great. I will help you heal, and we will work to fix it
so that Americans will never again suffer in the way that they have during this disaster. All right. And so in our next class, we will look at the beginning of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal program to address the suffering of the Great Depression. Thank you a whole lot.